High poly. In this chapter, we will learn a little bit of theory, and then go over several subdivision methods, their pros, cons, and use cases. A high poly mesh is not just about smoothing or extra bevels. It's about the highest level of accuracy and detail we can flesh out in a model. With the precise base mesh model we have obtained for the revolver, the difference in fidelity between it and the high poly will not be big. It will come down to the small details, like part separation. The weapon must look like it is built the same way it would be in real life, by discernible separate pieces, not by uniform shapes. These pieces are not just stuck together. Realism comes from connectors, screws, bolts, clamps, etc. Material separation, on the other hand, can be visualized in high poly just by the size of the edge bevels and the overall smoothness of the pieces, as well as with visible manufacturing defects, like injection molding lines. Even the smallest, simplest shapes can have a huge impact in the final look of the materials. We have to consider how these materials look and feel in real life, and establish these differences in the high poly. We also add surface details present on the references, paneling lines, holes, indentations. Nowadays, I usually stay away from smaller custom details in the high poly phase, like markings, scratches, decals, bumps. Instead, I prefer to add those details in texture later, to preserve editability and make it easier to iterate until the very last moment. In my Lebedev pistol project, like the one in the image, I learned those lessons the hard way. I modeled in high poly the knurled pattern on the grip, and also the Kalashnikov logo on the slide. They both ended up being more trouble than they were worth. The inability to adjust the normal strength became an issue, and I actually had to manually Photoshop out the logo and reapply it directly inside Painter for more control. For games, it's generally a good idea to exaggerate the bevel widths in high poly pieces, but they should remain on a realistic level, for the screen at least. It's easy to go overboard with smoothing and end up with a blob-looking mesh. A lot of high poly information is lost during the bake, and when textures are MIP-mapped or downscaled, so exaggerating bevels is a way to compensate for that. Thinking ahead how to translate each high poly piece and detail into the low poly will inform how we should model them in the first place. We should decide as soon as possible which surface details to bake flat versus which ones to keep in geometry. When baking details flat into a surface, we should consider a couple things. Modeled details on the high poly should not be too deep underneath the main surface to obtain a correct bake. The shape's edges of bolts, holes, etc. should be angled or rounder, so the baked normal map catches more light, especially over distance. In the end, what really counts is the final low poly result. A great looking high poly will be for nothing if the next steps are rushed and done incorrectly. A high poly model for games is just a temporary piece to achieve a good bake for the low poly. We should get as much out of the bake as we can. Any shortcut we can master to achieve higher end quality and/or production speed is most welcome. Things like remeshers, bevel modifiers, double smoothing for quick and dirty results, bevel shaders, automatic polish methods. Nothing is off the table in game production. Quality should already be a given, so let's research and use any helpful tool we can to speed things up. Looking back at my professional career, I have used many tools to create high poly meshes. From everything fully made in traditional sub-D in Blood and Truth, to absolutely zero sub-D in Cyberpunk, since everything was mid-poly models and mesh decals. And then back to baking for Hand Showdown, only this time sub-D is complemented a lot by remesh and smooth methods inside ZBrush, or more recently completely inside Blender. And if tomorrow I find an easier or faster way to get to the required quality bar, I will start using it right away. Now, let's discuss different methods of obtaining high poly meshes. While they are mostly interchangeable, and we can probably achieve similar results using any of them, each one tends to be more convenient for specific shapes and use cases. We will have to decide which smoothing approach fits best on a piece-by-piece basis. I will first give a short explanation of each method, then discuss some of their pros and cons, and end up with some tips and tricks that I have learned over time. The first one, as it should be, is traditional subdivision. A subdivision surface is a curved surface represented by a more polygonal mesh, the base mesh, and generated by a recursive algorithm. With subdivision surface, every face turns into 4, and every edge divides in 2, getting a new vertex in the middle. This method is a traditional old-school subdivision method. We can always count on it working, and it has the highest skill ceiling of all of them. It takes a lot of practice to completely master it. Here are its pros and cons. It allows for an extreme level of control and precision. We get full control over every surface and edge. It's easier on the hardware than the brute force methods like remesh and smooth. Subdivided geometry is relatively clean, especially when it's mostly quads. This is the method used in animation and VFX. It's also very difficult on complex pieces and requires some degree of planning from the start. For example, the number of edges in cylinders will have to be planned from the get-go if we are adding any details to them. It's relatively slow and tedious, with a lot of repetitive work. Finally, it's also a destructive method, meaning editability is poor. Iterating on pieces after they are subdivided is a problem, especially if changes are substantial or affect multiple parts. And finally, some tips. We will need a second support loop for straight surfaces. Insufficient support loops in big planar surfaces will translate to big gradients in the normal map, due to the surfaces not being perfectly flat and curving a bit towards the edges. Make sure planar faces are actually planar. Because of the sheer amount of geometry in a base mesh, any edit step done without sufficient care will result in uneven surfaces. It can become such a hassle that sometimes it's better to remove the support loops, edit the mesh, and then create them again. When adding support loops to complex pieces, remember to weld frequently. It's easy to get overlapping edges and vertices when adding new loops. Keeping base geometry as reduced as possible is better for controlling curved surfaces. The surfaces will subdivide more cleanly since the algorithm is doing it instead of us. Besides, it's also quicker. Try to maintain an overall even geometry density. Keep loops in curves at similar distances between them to avoid pinching and shading discontinuities. Keep as many quads as possible, and try to make the quad strips connect and loop around the piece. This does not matter in planar surfaces. Next up is crease. Creasing is a very fast way of controlling a subdivision modifier, instead of adding tedious and destructive support loops. It hardens the selected edges, replacing support loops. Here are its pros and cons. Speed and convenience. It's way faster to set up than support loops, and as opposed to them, it's non-destructive. If we only need quick and dirty results before we add support loops, crease is our choice for temporary hardening the edges. This is a good idea when testing subdivision on parts of a mesh without all of it becoming a blob. It's very useful in combination with other methods. Sometimes, when smoothing complex surfaces, we just need sub-D on a specific part of the mesh. We can obtain the big curves with traditional sub-D and leave the smallest base bevels sharp using crease. Then we can smooth the whole piece using another faster method, like remesh. Crease is difficult to control. It lacks the versatility of traditional sub-D. Our only way of using it is applying a multiplier to edges or verts, and for more difficult parts we need more granular control that crease just does not give. If we want to use it for the final subdivision of a mesh, creased edges need support loops too for control, albeit fewer of them. Some final tips. Crease is not my main choice to fully subdivide pieces, but it's a great way to obtain a dense base mesh for the remesh method. I use it in pieces that are too hard to make procedurally, mostly complex curves. It is also useful when obtaining low poly meshes. Since it's way easier to remove loops than it is to add them manually, we can just crease the sharp edges, add 1 or 2 levels of subdivision, and done. Now we have some dense surfaces that we just need to optimize. Stop adding and matching tons of loops by hand. Next up is the bevel modifier workflow. This is an interesting one that I'm not super experienced with. The idea is to create a low poly mesh straight up, using the amount of geometry we actually need in the game, and with decent shading. Then, we just apply bevel modifiers to it, in the parts that we need to look smooth. Our high poly then is basically the same mesh as the low poly, beveling its edges instead of subdividing the whole thing. Essentially, we are trying to be as minimalistic as possible. The high poly will be the exact same as the low poly, but with some extra bevels. That means it will bake extremely well, since both meshes will be almost the same. No more waviness in cylinders. With this method, we will bake an 8-sided cylinder with a bevel into an 8-sided cylinder without a bevel. We just fake the high poly in the normal map, since that is really all we need. This is also the way to go for mid-poly workflows that don't require baking. In this case, we just use a bevel modifier with a single step, and then tweak the vertex normals by weighing them towards the big faces. This can be done manually or with the weighted normals modifier. Now for the pros and cons. It is fast and non-destructive. Since there is no subdivision at all, we don't need support loops or creases. We just add modifier-driven bevels. It provides extremely good performance, because we are barely adding more geo to the low poly to make our high poly. The shading in both high and low poly must be perfect for this to work. We will likely have to fix vertex normals manually. We can use the weighted normals modifier for easy pieces, but for finer results, it's better to collapse the bevel and control shading manually with the Yavny add-on, which I will showcase in the low poly stage of this tutorial. It's difficult to control and doesn't always work. In many cases, the modifier just does not allow us enough control to achieve the result we need without collapsing it first, which loses part of the appeal of this technique. It's great for simple pieces though. Next up is the remesh and smooth workflow. This method is great because it doesn't care about our geometry. We just need enough density so the remeshed object does not look too faceted, which is easy to achieve using modifiers. Essentially, we just recreate or remesh the model with ultra-high polygon density, and then smooth it using automatic methods. I have been using this method for years on my weapon models, exporting the base meshes and booleans separately from Blender, and applying them inside ZBrush, after which I polish them. This was a bit slower because of the export steps, although ZBrush still beats Blender in raw high poly performance by a mile. More recently though, since the introduction of reliable exact booleans, I decided to keep the whole remesh process inside Blender. I used live booleans, voxel remesh, and then the smooth corrective modifier, which, on top of achieving very similar results to ZBrush, is non-destructive. It is extremely easy to modify the smoothing amount by just changing the iteration counter of the smooth corrective modifier. Pros and cons. It works in any geometry as long as its curves are dense enough to support a clean smoothing. Iterations are fast and easy, as we can keep all our modeling before the smoothing step. We can only have one bevel size per modifier. Usually, I just make the smooth modifier provide the minimum edge width of any given piece. All the other bigger bevels should instead be modeled or booleaned away. Performance can be abysmal with very high remesh and/or smooth values. We need to get around it by being clever about which stuff we keep live and which we collapse into a static mesh. Now, some tips. If the voxel remesher does not work out of the box in our geometry, it breaks the mesh, just apply a sharp remesher before it. It will be even slower and heavier, but it will work. There is a hard cap on the voxel remesher size of 0.1 mm. We can get around this by scaling our piece up, applying the scale, and then scaling down the same amount. Be careful though, this will also affect every other modifier that depends on scale, like bevels. We will also have to remember to collapse the mesh to avoid errors during export. As soon as we decide a high poly piece is done and dusted, we should apply a decimate modifier, and then collapse the modifier stack. A decimated model has almost the same detail level as a complete one, but a much lower poly count. This means faster operations on it, be it baking, exporting, and even saving the file. We also get back our hardware performance. Blender recalculates the modifier stacks every time objects get in and out of the viewport, and with the smoothing process kept live, it will take us minutes to just enable and disable some collections. Another option is to just keep those live high polys in forbidden collections, whose activation takes very long but that we don't use frequently. A byproduct of decimating though is shading errors. We will have to manually clean up the worst offenders or else they will show up in the normal map after the bake. The bevel shader from Blender's Cycles renderer simulates or fakes the high poly bevels according to the shader value we determine. We don't even need special geometry for this. Our dirty base mesh or low poly will already do the trick. With a little bit of scene configuration and a couple of light sources, we can obtain awesome looking fake high polys. Pros and cons. It is an extremely quick and easy method, great for testing prototype shapes or for offline renders that don't need good topology or optimization. No need for high poly geo, we can keep meshes dirty and simple. It's only good for smallish bevels, since the shader does not affect the model's silhouette. The bigger the bevels, the less real they will look. It only works on the Cycles renderer, not Eevee, so it is not a real-time result. There will be rendering-related visual artifacts, noise, and grain, unless we keep it still and let it calculate for a bit. We can of course turn this into a usable real-time result by baking it down. There is no high poly geo to export for baking. If we want it as a normal map, we need to bake it inside Blender. This is a bit cumbersome compared to Painter or Marmoset Toolbag, although some add-ons will help the process. Tips. To get different bevel sizes with the shader, we can just create several materials with different bevel values and apply them to our different looking pieces. Set a low render samples value if working directly in Cycles so the viewport is faster. Smoothing out meshes using Blender's Sculpt mode is the most similar experience to doing the old Dynamesh plus Polish in ZBrush. There is a remesh and smooth step involved, but they are not modifier based, they work in the same destructive capacity as they do in ZBrush. Blender's Sculpt mode removes editability from the equation, trading better overall performance for it. There are two main methods of smoothing out pieces in Sculpt mode. The first one is the Mesh Filtered Brush in Smooth mode. This is a destructive equivalent to the Smooth Corrective modifier. We just click and drag, and the mesh gets progressively smoother. It's a very quick and easy method. It's convenient, and if we want to sculpt something anyway, like adding some custom edge damage to the pieces, we already have it there. It tends to leave artifacts in non-straight edges, but it's good enough for smaller and important pieces. It gives the user little control over the smoothing process, although we can use the mask brush to cancel out parts of the meshes from smoothing. The second and much more complicated method is the Edit Face Set brush in Fair Tangency mode. When we assign face groups to our hard edges and grow them to their desired bevel size, Fair Tangency gives them a perfectly round connection to the face groups next to them. This tool allows for better, more finely tuned results, but they come at the price of a more complex configuration step. Its results are very good. Bevels are perfect with zero artifacts, similar to what we would obtain in ZBrush. More control over the width of bevels. We don't need to mask things, bevels are controlled directly by face groups that we can grow and shrink. It's tedious to set up. The creation of face groups in Blender is a bit flawed and unintuitive. Still, this is a degree of control we don't get with the Smooth modifier.